Okay, so orientation, right? Let's go in reverse order from last time. So we have the proximal end, which is always the tip. That's always the ends of the limbs, right? So the hand is proximal and the center of the body, I'm sorry, the hand is distal and the center of the body is proximal. So in relationship to the chest, the hand is distal. In relationship to the chest, the elbow is distal, the shoulder is distal. In relation to the hand, the elbow is proximal. The shoulder is proximal to the hand. The chest is proximal to the hand, right? As you start to go further out, you go further distal. As you start to come further in, you come further proximal. So one of the questions on the test was there's a pain somewhere between the shoulder and the elbow. There's a pain somewhere in this area. And the question is it proximal to the elbow? They mean in relationship to. Is it proximal to the elbow or is it proximal to the shoulder? Is it distal to the elbow? Is it, etc. And the answer is that it's proximal in relationship to the elbow. So here's the elbow. This is proximal to the elbow. Distal to the shoulder is not one of the examples. Okay, so proximal, distal, right? For the lower body, it looks like proximal and then distal. So hopefully you're touching and moving like that. All right. And then medial and lateral is the midline or the median line. So this is medial and out here is lateral, right? So I'm moving in a medial direction, moving my hand in a medial direction. Then now I'm moving it laterally. And as I explore the body laterally, I go further out to the side. So the elbow is lateral to the center of the body. The pectoralis muscle is lateral, more lateral than the sternum, right? The ribs are more lateral than the sternum. The sternum is more medial than the ribs. The two kidneys are on lateral aspects of the body, the left and the right. The pyloric sphincter of the stomach is medial, and the entrance of the small intestine, I forget what that valve is, forget what that sphincter is, that's more lateral. When you look at structures like the hand in anatomical position, remember that anatomical position is always with the palms facing forward, right? So usually we say ulnar versus radial, right? Like ulnar side versus radial side, but technically the ulnar side, if you're looking at it in an anatomical position, is medial and the radial side is lateral. So this would be medial and then lateral, right? And then the same for the foot. The foot would be, this would be medial and this would be lateral. And you would have the medial malleolus, all the things that I do for you guys. You would have the medial malleolus and then the lateral malleolus. So hopefully now you understand why those are medial and lateral. Okay, and then anterior and posterior, again, anatomical position with the palms facing forward. The anterior portion of the body. The anterior portion of the body is the chest or the ventral surface, right? The face, the midline, the belly button, the abdomen, front of the pelvis, and the posterior portion is the back of the pelvis, the glutes, the back, the spine, the spinal erector group, the occiput, the back of the head, right? Looking at the limbs, the anterior portion would be where this part of the elbow is. This is called the cubital fossa. And the biceps would be anterior, the triceps would be posterior, the extensor muscles of the forearm would be posterior, the flexor muscles of the forearm would be anterior. For the palm, there's a special term, it's called volar, right? So the anterior portion or the palmar side is also called volar, and the back is dorsal. For the foot, the bottom of the foot is referred to as plantar, and the back of the foot is referred to as dorsal. So when we look at the movements of the foot, moving toward the sole or toward the plantar is plantar flexion, and then moving towards the dorsal aspect is dorsal flexion. For height, we have superior and inferior, also sometimes called coronal and caudal, but I don't think you're ever going to see coronal and caudal except for the use of coronal in terms of the coronal plane, which in my opinion is a little bit confusing. But superior and inferior, those are also relative, right? So the head is superior relative to the center of the body or relative to the torso. Torso is inferior relative to the head. But the torso would be superior relative to the umbilicus or the pelvis or the lower limb. Lower limb, umbilical, or pelvis would be inferior relative to the torso. So I'm moving my hand now in a superior orientation. I'm moving my hand now in an inferior orientation. Again, remember the anatomical positioning, right? Remember that you always look at the body from the front. So this is always the anterior surface. The body is always standing. So this is always superior and this is always inferior. And as you look at the limbs, you travel further distal. That is technically inferior, although they prefer the term distal. And as you travel upward along the humerus towards the shoulder, that is technically superior, although the term proximal is preferred. Okay, so you guys say these, wait, are we done with these? Yeah, we're done with the orientation, but let's go over them one more time, just like rapid fire, right? And touch where I'm touching. So distal and proximal, distal and proximal, right? Medial and lateral, medial and lateral. Good. Anterior and posterior, right? Anterior and posterior, also called ventral and dorsal, right? Volar and dorsal, volar and dorsal. Touch the sole of your foot. So just get this notification out of the way so I can see. Plantar and dorsal, plantar and dorsal. Medial and lateral, medial and lateral, right? Medial and lateral, also called ulnar, ulnar and radial, right? Medial and lateral, medial and lateral. Superior, inferior, superior, inferior, superior, inferior. Okay, what's next? Planes. Frontal plane, also called the coronal plane. Okay, you guys unmute. Unmute now. Everybody unmute so I can like hear you talk. So which movements are happening with my shoulder right here? What movement is this?
Adduction.
You're gonna be like, yes. Mama, can you get out my house? And I'm like, no, you didn't get out mine. I'm gonna come over to your house and I'm gonna just come in and turn on every light in your house. Why? Because you do it to me.
Okay. Can the individual who's having the discussion about turning every light on in the house, can you leave your mute on, please? And everybody else, unmute yourself, please. Okay, so this movement here, right? This is AB duction, right? And this is AD duction, like adding toward the midline. So say this with me. So frontal plane is AB and AD duction. Frontal plane is AB and AD duction. And now move your head this way. This is lateral or side flexion. Frontal plane contains lateral or side flexion. Frontal plane contains the lateral or side flexion of the thoracic and the lumbar spine, right? Frontal plane does abduction and adduction of the hip and leg, abduction and adduction of the hip and the leg. Everybody, if you're like relatively quiet, can I hear you? Can I ask you guys to unmute so that I can hear you saying, you know, frontal and abduction and all that? And now do this. This is flexion and extension. Right, I'll turn to the side so you can see as well. Flexion at the shoulder and extension at the shoulder. So this is the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane contains flexion and extension at the shoulder. Right. It also contains flexion and extension at the neck, flexion and extension through the spine, flexion and extension through the hip joints, flexion of the leg at the hip, extension of the leg at the hip. Right, those are all sagittal plane movements. And then there's transverse plane. Transverse plane includes turning, includes rotation with the cervical spine. It includes rotation through the rest of the spine. It includes cross flexion of the shoulder, right, or cross adduction of the shoulder. Am I missing anything for transverse or horizontal? No, I don't think so. I think that's enough. Oh, transverse or horizontal includes external rotation of the humerus, as well as, which would include internal rotation of the humerus as well, right? So external and then internal rotation of the humerus. And then for the leg, it would include external rotation and internal rotation of the femur at the hip. Okay, let's get a little bit more into joint movements. So we just did flexion of the shoulder and extension of the shoulder. Flexion of the shoulder and extension of the shoulder. Right, now let's do flexion of the elbow and then extension of the elbow. And now the wrist. So flexion of the wrist, extension of the wrist. Right, flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder, flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow. Give me a sec to catch up. Good. And then let's do flexion of the spine and the neck. So the neck is flexed, my spine is flexed. Now let's do, I'm gonna raise my hands up so you can see. Let's do extension of the spine. Okay. Extending my spine and flexing my spine. Now just the hip joints. So I'm flexing the hip joints, right? And I'm extending through the hip joints. And now for the lower leg, I guarantee they're going to ask you about, sorry, all this stuff is here because I'm like putting up a weight rack. But anyway, they're going to ask you about, like, you know, if a soccer player kicks the ball with the right leg forward, is it the hip flexors or is it the glutes? You know, you need to know where the muscles are, where the position of the leg is, where the muscles are, and what joint movement is being performed, right? So this is flexion at the hip. This is extension at the hip. And you'll see it written as flexion of the leg at the hip, or flexion of the hip, or flexion of the leg, right? Which the latter is not specific enough, although you will see it from time to time. So it's hip flexion, hip extension, or leg extension and flexion at the hip, right? And then it's knee flexion and knee extension, and then plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion, so see these with me, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, knee flexion, knee extension, hip flexion, hip extension. Yeah, and now let's do some rotation. So external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation.
External rotation, internal rotation.
External rotation of the shoulder, internal rotation of the shoulder. External rotation, internal rotation. This one you really need to know. I see this question on MBLEx prep apps all the time, with the arm position like this. This is external rotation. This is internal rotation. External and internal. Okay. External. I hope you guys are all moving like this. And internal. external rotation and internal rotation. Look at the movement of the humerus. The movement of the humerus is what you should concentrate on. External and internal rotation. The humerus is rotating that way. Now it's rotating this way, internal rotation. And if we have the arm up with the humerus rotating that way, it's external rotation, and rotating this way is internal rotation. External rotation, internal rotation, external, internal, external, internal. If you flex the shoulder, all the way up, and then rotate from here, it looks like this: external rotation, internal rotation, external rotation, internal rotation. You can look at your elbow or look at your at your humerus and notice which way the elbow is pointing. External rotation, internal rotation. Yeah. And at the elbow,
External, internal.
yes. At the elbow, please go ahead and mute yourselves. At the elbow, there's also rotation, although it's called pronation and supination, right? Pronation and supination. Let's see if I'm missing anything. Okay, that's good for that. Let's look at some shoulder blades. I'm going to take my shirt off. Don't be shocked. Okay, we're all grown-ups. I think we're all grown-ups. Maybe someone is not a grown-up. Okay, so the shoulder blade movement with elevation and then depression. Everybody see my shoulder blades? Yeah.
Mhm.
Elevation and depression. Please hit your mute buttons. Okay. And then retraction. And then protraction. Retraction and protraction. All right. From the front and side, it looks like this. So elevation and then depression. Right? Elevation, feel your upper traps contracting. Depression, feel your lats contracting. Right? And then pronation, feel your pecs contracting, such as they are. And then retraction, feel your rhomboids contracting. Now put your arms up like this, like you're in a push-up position or a plank or whatever, right? And do it this way. So now it's protraction and retraction. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get right in the frame so you guys can see me. So protraction of the shoulder blade, retraction of the shoulder blade, elevation of the shoulder blade, depression of the shoulder blade. Okay, one more time. Repeat after me now. Let's try it with the arms down. Scapular. We use the term shoulder blade. Now we're going to use the term scapular. Scapular elevation, scapular depression.
Scapular depression.
Yeah, mute yourself, please. Scapular elevation, scapular depression. All right, and now scapular protraction, scapular retraction, scapular protraction, scapular retraction. Okay, while I have my shirt off, I'm going to show you the various fibers of the latissimus dorsi, because these are going to be important for you to know and to know clearly. Okay, so raise your arm up, find the tip of your shoulder blade. Maybe if I sit down, I'll be a little bit closer to this initial. Yeah. Okay, so find the tip of your shoulder blade. First, raise and lower your arm. Feel the tip of the shoulder blade moving against your finger. This is kinesthetic learning, right? This is called the scapular rhythm. Technically, the scapulothoracic rhythm. So it's the rhythm of the change in the angle of the scapula and the thoracic spine. All right. So the latissimus dorsi, it attaches to the internal portion of the humerus, internal portion of the arm bone. And it comes back here and it attaches to the inferior border of the scapula and then goes all the way around to the thoracic spine. Let me see if I can get it to pop out a little bit. You can see it right here. All right. Now try depressing your shoulder blade, touching the tip of the scapula. Hopefully you can feel the muscle fibers starting to contract, to bulge out a little bit. So depress your scapula, elevate your scapula, depress your scapula, and you'll feel what's called the thoracic fibers of the lat contracting. All right, now from right there, go all the way down to your hip bone. For men, that's right above where the waistband is. Right, and now depress your shoulder blade. Press your shoulder blade and you'll feel the fibers contracting there. That's the lumbar region of the lats. Okay, time to restore dignity. Let's see what happened today. I got fired. I got half naked. I was good. How was your day, dear? What the hell happened? Okay, inversion and eversion. So we did protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. Abduction, adduction. We did those. Remember, we were doing the frontal plane, coronal plane. We did abduction, adduction. We did supination, pronation, elevation, depression, protraction, retraction. Now inversion, and eversion. If you cannot hear me or cannot see or something, just unmute yourself and call out. Okay. I may not be aware of all problems. So medial and lateral rotation. Medial and lateral rotation is the same as internal and external rotation. We did those just a moment ago through the hip joint and also through the shoulder. I'll show you one more time just so it sticks in your mind. This is lateral rotation and this is medial rotation. So lateral toward the side and then medial toward the midline. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, we did those. Wrist radial deviation. Also, we'll do it this way. I'm doing it in this position because this is anatomical position, right? This is anatomical position, right? Like this. So the wrist has an ulnar side and a radial side. So this is radial deviation and ulnar deviation. Radial deviation and ulnar deviation. This is anatomically correct. Now flip your wrist over like this, right? And then do ulnar deviation, radial deviation, ulnar deviation, radial deviation. Look at your hand. Look at your hand. Now turn your hand like this and do ulnar deviation and radial deviation. Bye-bye. Okay, we did lateral flexion of the neck and spine. We did horizontal abduction and horizontal adduction. Remember, there's also a diagonal abduction, diagonal adduction, AB like abducting, AD like adducting, and then there's circumduction, where the tip of a limb or the vertex of the head makes a big circle, and the part that joins the body is a central axis, makes no circle, basically. Okay. Concentric and eccentric. Ooh, yes. Time for the pain. Okay, everybody unmute yourself. All right, so let's take a look at concentric and eccentric for the neck. Remember, when there's a concentric contraction, I'm gonna start with the bicep actually, because it's a little bit clearer. Can everyone see clearly? It looks like there may be some schmutz on my camera. Is my image clear? Or clear enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's start with the bicep because that's really obvious. So the muscle fibers are running this way. So when the bicep contracts in a concentric contraction, con meaning with, the fibers are going this way. The fibers are going in the direction they're supposed to contract, like that. And when I extend my elbow, the fibers are going away from each other. That's ec or eccentric, ECC, ec, eccentric. Okay, so I'm going to play a little like game of, call and response with you. Not call and response, and question and answer, right? So I want you to tell me, where is the concentric, which muscle, where's the concentric contraction when I flex my elbow? Bicep, yeah, unmute yourself, Stephanie. Okay, now where's the concentric contraction when I extend my elbow?
Tricep.
That's right. My hand is palm down. This is also called what? Dorsiflexion or plantar flexion?
Plantar.
I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Pronation or supination?
Pronation.
Pronation. That's right. Am I extending or flexing my wrist right now?
Flexing, I think.
Extending.
Okay.
Extending. Where's the concentric contraction?
Elbow.
In the wrist extensors or in the wrist flexors?
And the wrist extensors.
That's right. Where's the concentric contraction and flexion, wrist flexion now?
and the extenders, I mean flexors.
In the flexors, that's right. If I flex my neck, where is the concentric contraction, in the front or in the back?
Front.
That's right. If I extend through my thoracic spine, let's see, can you guys see this? If I extend through my spine, where's the concentric contraction, in the spinal erector group or in the abdomen?
Abdomen.
Concentric contraction, spinal extension,
Yes.
spinal extension. Is it in the spinal erector group or in the abdomen?
Erector group.
That's right. And if I flex through my spine, is it in the abdomen or the spinal erector group, the concentric contraction?
Spinal.
Concentric contraction, spinal flexion. Is it in the is it the concentric in the abdomen or in the spinal erector group?
In the abdomen.
And the
Yeah, one more time for the team. Flexion through the spine. Am I contracting concentrically in the abdomen or concentrically in the spinal erector group?
Abdomen.
Abdomen. Okay. We need to do this one more time to be really clear. All right. So if you can lay down, please lay down. Okay. You should be able to see me if I'm right about here. Can everybody see me okay?
Mhm.
yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm lifting my head, my shoulders, and my knees. I'm going into like kind of a fetal position, a crunch position, not fetal, crunch position, right? And this is flexion through the spine. Where's the concentric contraction?
Your abdomen.
The abdomen. Thank you. And now I'm in quadruped position. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Feel free to join me on the floor. Quadruped position, and now I'm in spinal extension. Where's the concentric contraction?
In your
Spine.
spine.
In the spinal erector group. In the spinal erector group. Yeah.
Spinal
Erector.
rector group.
Great.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Now I'm walking. And I have my right foot behind me and I'm pushing off to walk or to run. Where's the concentric contraction, in the glutes or in the hip flexor?
And the hip flexor.
The concentric.
Glute.
Which muscle is shortening? The glute. Yeah.
No, the
Is the-
glutes.
The glutes.
Yeah. The glutes are shortening, right? So the fibers are going. The contraction is going in the direction of the fibers, not away. Now the glute fibers are contracting eccentrically. They're moving away. They're lengthening. Eccentric, eccentric, right? And the hamstring, is that contracting concentrically as I push off? Is that contracting concentrically or eccentrically?
Eccentrically.
Eccentric.
As I push off. Oh, yeah. You're right. Very good. Very good. Okay. And if I have the ball of my foot on the floor and I press the ball of my foot in the floor and lift up my heel, where's the concentric contraction? In the gastrocs or in the tibialis anterior?
Tibialis anterior.
Concentric.
The
Gastroc.
The
Gastroc.
gastrocs. That's right. And then if I put my heel on the floor and lift up my toes, where's the concentric contraction? In the tibialis
And the-
anterior or in the
In the
gastroc?
Oh, I see.
In the tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior, right. Very good. What's the name of these muscles on the side of the leg between the knee? Side of the leg between the knee and the ankle. What's the name of those muscles? They're variously called the peroneals. Have you heard those?
Mhm.
And have you also heard them called extensor something? I'll have to get that name for you, but the peroneals are active in eversion of the ankle. Eversion of the ankle. Is this concentric or eccentric contraction of the peroneals?
Eccentric.
Concentric. Eversion of the
Concentric.
ankle. Eversion of the ankle is concentric. These are shortening at the moment. Okay. Now, you thought it was torture to begin with. Here we go.
Information you guys emailed to us. I don't remember seeing it in my emails.
What's that? Is the question, did we
The-
cover this last time and provide notes for it?
No, no, do we have the information that's on here in our emails? Or
We don't,
do we have?
we don't have, we don't have, I didn't list which muscle is concentric and which is eccentric for specific movements. Is that your question?
No, just like what we're going through, like to review it.
This is
Not
new.
necessarily like not necessarily the pictures or anything, just like like the wording, the definitions.
The concentric and eccentric we defined last time. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So now let's do a little bit more eccentric, and let's also define the agonist, antagonist, and the synergists. Okay. So this may get a little bit, we're going to really get into your knowledge of kinesiology now. So the biceps muscle is known for doing elbow flexion. I'm not going to do every muscle in every region like I tried to do a minute ago. The biceps muscle is known for doing elbow flexion or forearm flexion, right? By the way, what's the name of this bone right here? Is this the humerus or the femur?
Humerus.
Humerus, very good. And the femur is in the leg. And what's the name of these two bones? Is this the radius and the ulna, or the tibia and fibula?
The radius and ulna.
Yeah, and collectively we can refer to those as forearm. And this does forearm flexion or elbow flexion, but the biceps also does shoulder flexion. So there is some action of flexion of the elbow through the biceps, and I believe it's long head that does a little bit of flexion of the humerus. Flexion of the humerus at the shoulder. Okay, so if I'm just doing a bicep curl, if I'm just flexing my elbow, which one is the prime mover? Which is the prime mover, the bicep or the tricep?
The bicep.
That's correct.
Tricep.
What's another? The bicep. And we're going this way. The muscle fibers are shortening. The muscle fibers are traveling the direction that they're designed. So this is concentric. This is the prime mover for elbow flexion for a bicep curl. And next question, the prime mover is also called what? The agonist or the antagonist?
The agonist.
The agonist. That's correct. And which one is the antagonist? The tricep, lateral deltoid, or the forearm extensors? Which one is antagonizing the bicep? The tricep. That's correct. The tricep. That's correct. Okay. If I lift my arm, if I flex my shoulder, if I flex my arm at the shoulder joint, primarily I am using the anterior deltoid as the prime mover. What's another name for the prime mover? Antagonist or agonist?
Antagonist.
Agonist. Yes, very good, Vincent. I'm primarily using the prime mover agonist of the anterior deltoid, but I'm also using another muscle, which is a synergist. Which muscle also does flexion of the humerus? At the elbow, it does this movement. It flexes the elbow. At the shoulder or the glenohumeral joint, the same muscle assists in flexion. Which muscle is it? It's the bicep.
Bicep.
So the anterior deltoid, everyone should be touching like this, touching your anterior delt and touching your bicep. So touch your anterior delt and then raise your arm up a little bit, flex your shoulder, feel how your anterior delt muscles are firing, right?
Yeah.
And that's antagonized by, I believe, either the posterior delt or the teres. Not sure which one, but my point is that the anterior delt is being assisted right now with the tricep, with the bicep. Now put your hand down on your bicep and flex your shoulder. Can you feel a little bit of contraction in the bicep muscle?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So the bicep is the synergist or the helper muscle for the anterior delt. So repeat after me. Shoulder flexion. The
Shoulder
agonist
flexion.
is the anterior deltoid. The agonist
Anterior
is the anterior deltoid. Yes, good. Synergist is the bicep.
Synergist is the bicep. Synergist
okay.
is the bicep.
Very good. Let's turn the statement around. The bicep is the synergist in shoulder flexion.
Bicep is the synergist in shoulder flexion.
The anterior deltoid is the prime mover. The anterior deltoid is the prime mover. Very good, very good. Okay. In hip extension,
Extension.
yes, thank you very much. Not yet. In hip extension, the glutes are the prime mover and the hamstring is the synergist. Okay, try that. In hip extension, the glute is the prime mover and the hamstring is the synergist. Please try that. In hip extension,
Hip extension.
the glute is the prime mover and the hamstring is the synergist.
Glute is a prime
Glutes
mover.
are the
And the hamstring is the synergist. And the hamstring is the synergist.
Hamstring is the
hamstrings are the synergist.
Hey guys,
Antagonist.
I'd rather be overwhelmed than underwhelmed. Hint, hint. All right, in hip flexion, the hip flexor is the prime mover. Let me hear you say that. In hip flexion, the hip flexor is the prime mover.
Flesh is the prime mover.
in hip like then the
Where's the
hip
prime
flexion.
Awesome. And the rectus femoris is the synergist. The rectus
Yes,
femoris is the synergist. That's
Is
right.
the synergist.
That's right.
Rectus femoris is the synergy.
Nice, nice. I am overwhelmed with your enthusiasm. Okay, everybody mute yourselves now. Feel free to unmute and call out if there's anything like really difficult or confusing that comes up. We're going to spend just a few minutes drilling this other stuff, and then we're going to move on to some more difficult stuff tonight, maybe a little bit like dense in terms of the information and exhausting, but not every night will be like this. Okay, we just got to get through like some of the more in-depth, like deeper stuff regarding the nervous system and muscles, and then that'll take tonight and the next session, and then after that we'll be able to move on to like other stuff that's not quite so demanding. All right, so in just a moment. Okay, my headset just cycled. Hide video panel. So let me just make sure that I'm using recording and then hide floating meeting controls. Okay, recall that for nerves, every nerve has a nerve body, which contains all the organelles, including a nucleus that you would expect to see in other cells. Growing out of the nerve body are dendrites, and dendrites are similar to axon terminals at the other end. The role of the dendrites, the role of the axon terminals is to increase surface area, to disperse and to collect information, sensory information, to disperse and to collect things like neurotransmitters. So you have the body, then you have the dendrites extending out of that. You have a long axon that extends out of the body. Oftentimes the axon is covered in Schwann cells, which provide myelin, or we would say the axon is myelinated, covered with a myelin sheath. And then there's an axon terminal at the end of the neuron. It's the job of neurons to carry action potentials that is also called an impulse or a nerve impulse. An action potential is, technically speaking, the movement of sodium and some potassium ions. Those are positively charged ions down an axon or up an axon. We may say that neurons, which is the same as a nerve cell, we may say that neurons conduct action potentials or that they propagate action potentials. We may say that neurons provide the movement of electricity, or conduct the movement of electricity, or conduct the movement of charged ions, or conduct the movement of charged particles. Ions are charged particles. A similar thing happens in muscle cells, but the process is not called action potentials. It's called excitation. Muscle cells are excited. They undergo excitation. Action potentials in neurons, excitation in muscles. contraction is the result of excitation in muscles. Sodium and potassium ions are the primary positive ions, which move across the cell membranes that's into the cells in order to raise the inner charge of the neuron or the muscle, to raise the charge of the neuron to a positive level. That process, do I not have that process written here? Okay, I need to correct that. So when there's an influx of sodium or positive particles, the interior of the nerve cell becomes more positive and less negative. A nerve, and I believe a muscle, has a resting state of negative 70 millivolts, negative 70 millivolts. As it becomes more positive, which is called depolarization, as it depolarizes and becomes more positive, it reaches a point where all the positive particles, all the positive ions have to move. They cannot continue to accumulate in one section. They have to move up or down the axon. And that point is usually reached at negative 55 millivolts. That's called threshold. So the resting state is negative 70. Threshold is negative 55. Threshold forces or allows for the propagation of an action potential or the conduction of a nerve impulse or excitation of a muscle contraction of a muscle, which leads to contraction. The place where a nerve and a muscle or a neuron and a muscle meet, that's called the neuromuscular junction, or the junction, the neuromuscular junction. That area is also called the synapse. The space between the neuron and the muscle is called the cleft. The area where the axon terminal touches the muscle, there is a plate, and that is called the motor end plate. So you have the nerve, here you have the nerve body, oops, sorry. Here you have, okay, Kim, have you ever used the internet? This is how it works. You have the nerve body, and you have dendrites extending from the nerve body. You have the long axon. Perhaps you can make out that there's like little sections here. That's myelination. It's a motor neuron, which does movement, right? The axon travels all the way down to a muscle fiber, and it terminates at the axon terminal. And if we zoom in, we can see the axon terminal more clearly, and the muscle fiber, and there's this little patch here, this little plate, that's the motor end plate, the motor end plate. There's 7 events that happen there. We're going to get into those a little bit later. Is that all we need for that? Yeah. I want to remind you that diffusion is the movement of particles from one area to another so that they're all diffused evenly. So all the particles are spread out throughout the area evenly, whether that's like a scent in a room or smoke in a room, or whether that's like salt in water or some kind of neurotransmitter inside a cell. Diffusion is the process of movement from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, so things are more even. Diffusion happens like out in the open or in a cell or in the air or in water. Osmosis happens across a membrane. The term that they use is a semi-permeable membrane. So osmosis is a kind of diffusion across a semi-permeable membrane. Inside of fluid, inside of blood, inside of cellular fluid, inside of the water in a lake or a stream or your bathtub, there are particles such as potassium, chloride, sodium, calcium. Those are called solutes. Solutes are particles. A solvent is the liquid that the particles are inside of, and together they make a solution. Solutes inside of a solvent is called a solution. A good way to remember that is that a thief broke into a building and filled a bag with loot. The police came, the thief hid the loot in a vent so he wouldn't get caught. That was his solution. Loot, vent, solution. Solute, solvent, solution. Intrafusal and extrafusal fibers, we're probably going to get into tonight. Let's just cover this. Voluntary and involuntary muscle are the two basic types of muscle. They also would include cardiac as its own category of muscle in terms of structure. But basically it's voluntary and involuntary muscle. So voluntary muscle fibers are striated muscle fibers. They are skeletal muscle. So that's muscles that attach to the bones, muscles that actually move the bones, right? Those are striated in appearance. Involuntary muscle, there are two types. There's smooth muscle, such as the muscle which lines the gastrointestinal tract, and those muscles contract involuntarily. And another type of involuntary muscle, other than smooth, is cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is kind of in between striated muscle and smooth muscle. It's like semi-striated. And cardiac muscle is also involuntary. It's not under our voluntary control. Involuntary muscle is also sometimes called visceral muscle. I want you to start pairing the terms visceral and somatic, right? Visceral and somatic. So viscera or visceral refers to the internal organs. Somatic refers to the body. That's the skin, the nerves, the muscles, the tendons, the bones, the ligaments. One of the questions on the MBLEx will probably, the MBLEx will probably ask you to differentiate between those. For example, a question that I've seen is, what kind of pain is a result of nerve, muscle, bone, or tendon? Is it somatic or is it visceral? What would the answer be?
Visceral.
Nerves. Okay, think about it, right? So nerves, muscles, tendons, bones. Is that the visceral organs or is that the soma body?
Visceral.
That's the soma. So somatic includes skin, nerves, muscles, tendons, and bones. So repeat after me. Somatic includes.
Somatic includes.
Good. Skin, nerves, muscle.
Skin, nerves,
muscle,
tendon,
and bone. And bones. Good. Okay. Now in reverse. Bones, tendons, muscles.
Bones, tendon, muscles.
Bones, muscles, nerves, and skin.
And tendons, nerves, and skin
Nerves
are
and
somatic.
skin are somatic.
Yes. Organs are visceral.
Organs are visceral.
Organs are visceral. So examples of visceral organs. Call out viscera.
Viscera.
Great. Call out the name of any organ which is a viscera.
Stomach.
The bladder.
Stomach, bladder,
Liver.
Liver.
liver,
Lung.
ovaries, uterus, intestine, small intestine, large intestine, pancreas, spleen, heart,
Bladder.
lungs, bladder. Yes, good. Very good.
Is
Okay.
all the organs?
Huh?
Is it all the organs or not? all?
Yeah. It's all the organs, including the endocrine glands, and I believe including the brain.
Okay.
All right, but mostly when they say viscera, what they mean are the internal organs. That's outside of that's not the brain. But so no, it doesn't include the brain. I mean, it doesn't matter. That's splitting hairs. I shouldn't have introduced confusion. Way to go, prof. Okay, so I think what we should do tonight is finish up with the nervous system. It's really expansive and exhausting. I think we should finish it and get it out of the way. And some things you're going to need to know, and some things you're like not going to need to know. I have two of the same document open here, and it's my job to attempt to guide you thoroughly enough that you can discern which is which, like what you really need to be able to recall. Think about that word, to recall, and what you need to just understand conceptually. So let's see. Give me just a moment to collect my thoughts. We'll do a few minutes and then we'll take a break. So we need flat peg. Yeah. Okay, so in the MBLEx March 2023 basics, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom now, and we're going to start working on, not all of this will be here. Actually, I'll just go to the next page. We're going to start working on the hypothalamus and pituitary, which also gets into neuron anatomy, and I'm going to call this the top of the endocrine system. A little, before we start, a little bit of like terminology or medical terminology. Endocrine means hormone or hormonal, which means adeno. Those are all the same. So you'll hear words like adenoid or adeno hypophysis, and a lot of alternative medicine providers, that's you guys, that's me, a lot of us will look at a word like adenohypophysis and just go adeno, and that's it. It pays to read every single part of that as adeno being endocrine or hormonal, hypo being below, and physis, I can't remember what that is. I think that's maybe refers to the refers to hypothalamus. I can't remember what physis means, but actually I'm gonna look that up, because physis, root word, physis, to develop or overcome, to grow. Okay. Word breakdown. Adeno hypophysis, anterior part of the pituitary. Yeah, thanks. We get it. Okay, I'll look that up a little bit later, but physis is something I think it would be nice to clarify. That one. Sorry guys, I should have given you a break and then done this. Oh, too late now. All right, so last week we went over this. In my opinion, my humble opinion, a nerve kind of looks like a tree with roots at the bottom and then branches at the top. If we flush out this drawing, which you should do, every nerve, as we says, has a body. Here's the axon. This is my rendering of myelin sheath, and then there's an axon terminal. If we continue the drawing, you'll see organelles inside of the nerve body, and then dendrites coming out of the body of the nerve. Here's another nerve, another neuron, which has other dendrites interfacing, interacting, connecting with the dendrites of the first neuron. The axon terminals are touching muscle, they're touching effector organs, right? Effector tissue. That could be organs like in the skin, like sweat glands. It could be muscle tissue, could be bones, could be vasculature. All right. Here's two terms which we should know, that's efferent and afferent. So efferent refers to, impulses that go out from the central nervous system to the effector organs. Afferent refers to impulses that go from the effector organs into the central nervous system. And you can remember them like this. So efferent and afferent. Efferent exits the central nervous system, while afferent arrives at the central nervous system. So you're going to see drawings later on like this, where there's this, all this is like totally abstract. I expect you to learn like this, which is why I have you like touching yourself and, and moving. So you're going to see this thing that looks like kind of a misshapen hockey puck with a butterfly in the middle. What is this?
Our brain.
Close. Close. It's got gray matter on, it's got white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. Look at the label. And if you can see that, it says spinal cord.
Oh,
C6, C7. So what they're showing you here is, this is a section of the spinal cord as if they made a transverse or horizontal cut through the spinal cord, opened it up, took off the top part, and put the camera down on top to look down at it. So you're looking at the top or the bottom of the spinal cord as it's cut in a transverse direction. So you'll see that this is the spinal cord, the central nervous system, spinal cord and brain, and you'll see arrows pointing out, and that's efferent impulses carried by efferent nerve fibers, exiting the central nervous system, exiting the spinal cord, and then arrows going in toward the spinal cord and toward the central nervous system, afferent, that's arriving, impulses that arrive at the central nervous system versus impulses that exit from the central nervous system. Afferent arrives in the central nervous system, efferent exits the central nervous system. If you want to add like a kinesthetic element to that, you just go like, you touch your spine, right? And then touch, I don't know, like your heart, right? So impulses going from the spinal cord to the heart would be exiting the central nervous system. Impulses going from the heart back to the spine would be arriving at the central nervous system. So exiting the central nervous system to the heart, arriving at the central nervous system from the heart, afferent. Just a little bit more, and then let's take a break. I strongly recommend that at some point you draw, especially the brain, the hypothalamus, the anterior and posterior pituitary, because it'll just make it so much more clear for you. Like when you draw it, you get it, you remember it. You do it twice, you do it once and you'll have it 80% more, I think. You do it twice, you'll have it like almost 100%. I'm just throwing these numbers out based on my subjective experience. So we have here the brain. We just looked at what a nerve looks like, what a neuron looks like. So we have the brain, that's the outside of the brain. And then we have the cerebellum, which hangs from the bottom of the brain like a bell. And then we have part of the brain stem. The skull envelops the cranium, envelops the brain, and the bottom of the skull cuts across right about here. So this is the level of the skull. The brainstem protrudes out of the skull and goes into the skull. What's inside the skull is the central nervous system. So part of the brainstem, part of the cranial nerves, part of the pons and the hypothalamus, those are inside, and part of the hypothalamus and part of the brainstem, I think it's correct, is outside, and that's I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's not central versus peripheral. It's cranial versus extracranial, I think. Okay, so anything inside the skull is cranial. Okay, maybe I should just stop talking and let you guys watch the videos. All right, deep inside the brain, like almost in the center, is an area called the thalamus. this region is called the thalamus. It's where there's a whole lot of nerves that start to collect. Nerves in the brain are tissue. They form structures. And just below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. So this region here is called the hypothalamus. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. Inside the hypothalamus, there's the gathering. Oh, I misspoke. There's the thalamus. That's the thalamus. This is the diencephalon. You don't need to know that. The hypothalamus is the region below the thalamus. Inside the hypothalamus, you find areas where lots and lots of neuron bodies and which have lots of dendrites, right? Lots of neuron bodies start to meet and gather. And when lots of bodies get together inside the brain, lots of nerve cell bodies start to meet inside the brain, those are called nuclei. When nerve bodies gather in the periphery, like there's all these like nerve bodies that gather outside the spinal cord on either side of the spinal cord, that's called ganglia. So it's ganglia in the periphery and nuclei in the central nervous system. We'll get to that later. And you don't need to remember, strictly speaking, ganglion and nuclei, but you're going to see those words, and it'll really help you to build out, to like flesh out the visual in your mind, to have that depth of knowledge. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a region where there's lots and lots of neuronal bodies or nerve cell bodies. Here's a couple other structures. And the nerve cell bodies, as they gather into the hypothalamus, they form nuclei, places where nerve cell bodies are gathered. You see these 4 regions here? That's just a handy way of splitting up the hypothalamus so that you can see it a little bit better, right? So it just be region 1, 2, 3, 4, or anterior to intermediate and posterior, however you want to label those, right? But just so you can see it, you don't really need to know that. And all these dots are like, let's say, dozens or hundreds of nerve cell bodies, and the nerve axons are going out into the rest of the brain and or down into the pituitary. So these nerve cell bodies receive impulses from the rest of the brain and send messages and neurotransmitters down into the pituitary glands. This is the like end of the nervous system and the beginning of the endocrine system. Please mute yourself, whoever that is. All right, so, and like we said earlier, impulses coming into the central nervous system, they are afferent, they arrive, letter A. Impulses going out from the central nervous system, they are efferent, they exit, letter E. The nuclei, which is a gathering of nerve cell bodies in the hypothalamus, the nuclei are responsible for monitoring different things. Each nuclei has like a different function or functions that are closely related to each other, like sleep, arousal would be in one nuclei. Visual and oculomotor would be in another nuclei. Hunger and satiety, or feeling full, would be in a different nuclei. Thirst, temperature, sex drive, mood, right? There's probably a different one for anger than there is for belonging or love, right? I don't know about that, but just hypothetically. Blood pressure. So all of these things that are that help us to monitor our body, to meet our basic needs, to keep us in homeostasis, to keep us in good balance. Those are all receiving information from the rest of the body in the nuclei of the hypothalamus. The nuclei of the hypothalamus, therefore, would receive information from your arm about the temperature of the air, and it would send information back out to the muscles, whether they should be relaxed or whether they should start trembling in order to warm the body up. It would receive information about the blood pressure in the rest of the body. It would receive information about calcium concentrations, hormone concentrations, temperature of the body, hydration, hunger, whether or not there is damage, whether or not there needs to be repair. The hypothalamus is the very, very top of the monitoring system. It's like the master control for the hormonal, the glandular, the endocrine system. It's technically in the nervous system, but you can see how closely related it is to the endocrine system. It controls the endocrine system. Okay, some of the nerve bodies. Okay, so what we're looking at here are nerve bodies, right, which make up nuclei, right? So we're looking at nuclei or nerve bodies in the hypothalamus that extend down into the pituitary gland. There are two interfaces for the pituitary and hypothalamus and pituitary. The first is the posterior pituitary. The axons of the nerve cell bodies in the hypothalamus, the axons extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary, and they make up the posterior pituitary. This means the posterior pituitary is made up of neuronal tissue. It's called the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary. They may ask you which one is the neuro and which is the adeno, but it's not going to be like multiple choice. It'll be phrased in a question such as, does the neurohypophysis or the adenohypophysis produce follicle stimulating hormone? So you have to know which hormones are produced in the front, which are produced in the back, what kind of tissue is in the front, what kind of tissue is in the back. It's not going to be a dozen questions. It'll be like one question, and all the questions between all the tests are randomized, so you may not get it at all. But if you get it and you miss it, if you get it, it's better to answer it correctly than incorrectly. I think we all can agree on that. Okay, anyway. Nerve cell bodies making up nuclei in the hypothalamus extend their axons directly down into the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary gland. Don't forget that what we're looking at here comes from this, right? We're seeing the posterior pituitary below the hypothalamus. In a minute, we'll look at the anterior pituitary. Hypothalamus with nuclei, and posterior and anterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary. Neurons extending axons directly into the posterior pituitary, neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary has mostly glandular tissue. So if you look at this brilliant genius drawing, you see these round black circles with dots in them. That's my rendering of endocrine cells. So those are cells with nuclei and organelles inside of them. So what happens is the way that it's built is the hypothalamus extends axons towards the anterior pituitary, and it secretes neurotransmitters, or sometimes it secretes things like dopamine or somatostatin, and those neurotransmitters, or like hormone precursors, they leave the axon terminals and they're absorbed into this bloodstream system, which is just dedicated to the anterior pituitary. It's called the portal system. So the portal system, or the vasculature for the anterior pituitary, it absorbs hormone precursors and neurotransmitters made by the hypothalamus, and it carries those hormone precursors and neurotransmitters down into the glandular tissue, into the adeno tissue, which makes up the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. And in the anterior pituitary, then, manufactured are stimulating hormones, which we'll go through after the break. So it's the job of the anterior pituitary to manufacture and store certain hormones and to release them. And it's the job of the posterior pituitary to receive and store a couple of hormones and then release them. we'll go over the specific hormones in a moment. And then in subsequent classes, I'll just be like, X hormone, Y hormone is in the posterior, X hormone, Y hormone is in the anterior, and you guys will repeat after me, hopefully. And then that'll be that, and then we'll move on, okay? All right, let's take a break. You guys, hopefully 10 minutes is enough. Time's it right now, 9:22 Eastern time, so come back at 9:32 Eastern time. Damn, good job hanging in there, guys. See you in 10 minutes. That's the deal. Okay, so let's finish up with this torture. Hopefully I'm giving you an idea also of what you need to know, what you don't need to know. And if everyone look what I do the rest of the time. You know, I don't just teach MBLEx. Oop, gotta edit this out. It's not supposed to see that. Okay, I've used a computer before. God. Technology. Okay, so the hormones that I would like you to be really familiar with are ADH, also called vasopressin, and oxytocin. And then these 7 hormones over here, which are called flat peg. So let's do the like smaller number, and then we'll tackle the bigger number after that. So ADH is called antidiuretic hormone, and it's also called vasopressin. Antidiuretic hormone is to combat the evacuation or the loss of water. So antidiuresis, diuresis means like the expenditure of water. Dia means across, and then rhesus has to do with fluid. So it's like the quick evacuation of fluid, right? Diarrhea is water. So antidiuretic means less peeing, actually. It means less sweating. It means drier poop, also called vasopressin. And the reason that you might need to conserve water, or you might need to vasopress, if that's a verb, is because perhaps your water levels are low, you're dehydrated, or perhaps your blood volume or your blood pressure is low, and you need to increase the blood pressure. And a good way to do that is to conserve fluid. Oxytocin, I believe, is categorized as an endorphin, a type of endorphin. Oxytocin is it's a feel-good hormone. It also creates bonding between human beings, or a feeling of bonding in the brain with someone else or with a pet. Or not, pets are people. Okay, anyway, oxytocin also reduces pain and increases feelings of pleasure. Oxytocin is what's released when we have something comforting or pleasurable or sweet. I mean, both taste and, metaphorically sweet. Okay. And ADH and vasopressin, ADH, also known as vasopressin, as well as oxytocin, are stored and released in the posterior pituitary. That's the neuro hypophysis. So I just added this. So down here, if we take a look at hormones of the posterior pituitary gland, it's oxytocin and ADH or vasopressin. Let me just make that a little bit more. Yeah, oxytocin and ADH or vasopressin. The hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, hormones of the anterior or adenohypophysis, are a little bit more involved. and they go by the acronym flat peg. And I'm going to outline each one of those for you, write down each one of those for you in a minute. Let's go over them here, and then I'll write them down. So flat peg stands for follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone causes the maturation of a follicle, which is the earliest form of an egg or an ovum in an ovary. Follicle stimulating hormone causes the maturation of an egg. Luteinizing hormone, I believe, causes the release of an egg from the ovary, which then goes into the fallopian tube and then into the uterus. Feel free to correct me if I switch anything. Unfortunately, sometimes I make mistakes. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands. So I just want you guys to know, when you hear words like adrenocorticotropic, every syllable of that word means something. Let me just put this down so I don't lose place. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. And I'm just putting these like slashes here just to break the word up into syllables. Okay, so adreno refers to the adrenals, right? And then cortico refers to the cortex or the outside, right? The cortex of the brain is the outside. That's the white matter. And then the gray matter is inside, right? The cortex of the kidney, the cortex of the adrenals. The cortex of the adrenals is the outside of the adrenal glands. And they're called adrenal, by the way, because ad means close to, just like adduction compared to abduction, adduction. It means close to, and then renal means kidney, adrenal, kidney. Cortex, outside. Cortex like cork, the bark of a tree, the cork of a tree. Cortex, not Cortez, although those Adidas Cortez are those are hot. Okay, then tropic. Tropic, I believe, refers to like the manufacture of hormones. Put that. And then hormone is hormone. Okay. Hormone. So adreno is adrenal, cortico is cortex, tropic is stimulating cells to manufacture hormones. In the case of the adrenal glands, it would be epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then hormone means hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Right, I'll summarize all those in a second. So the anterior pituitary makes and releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, and it does the rest of these two. Okay, let me give you an example so you have a little bit more context. Let me give you an example for each one of these. So during the follicular phase, I might be mixing up follicular and luteinizing phase. Please correct me if I do. During the follicular phase of the reproductive cycle, which is days like, I don't know, the first half of the reproductive cycle, days like 1 through 14. During the follicular phase, there is the maturation of the egg. So the anterior pituitary adenohypophysis releases follicle stimulating hormone during like day 1 of the menstrual or reproductive cycle. Around the midpoint of the menstrual cycle, around day 14, the adenohypophysis or anterior pituitary will release luteinizing hormone, which will cause the egg to be I don't know what the word is, will cause the egg to leave the ovary. That's the luteinizing phase, and the luteinizing phase has the egg traveling from the ovary through the fallopian tubes down toward the uterus, right? Waiting for fertilization. And then adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is manufactured and stored in the anterior pituitary, and it is released when the body senses that the amount of cortisol. Wait, just a minute. Search this stuff. CT, yeah, CTH. Okay, adrenocorticotropic hormone does act on the adrenals, and what does it cause the production of? It causes the production of not epinephrine and norepinephrine, as I said. It causes the production and release of cortisol, adrenocorticotropic. There's an example of a mistake. I'm sorry. So cortex, I'm going to put cortex and cortisol. So I wasn't too far off. I had cortex in there, and I had the right gland, which is closer than some mistakes I've made in the past, let me tell you. Adrenocorticotropic hormone therefore would be released from the anterior pituitary when the body is under stress, because cortisol is a stress hormone. Cortisol is released during times of higher stress. Thyroid stimulating hormone would be released from the anterior pituitary when the thyroid has to start manufacturing more thyroid hormone, more T3 and T4, thyroxine, thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones, they increase the metabolism or increase the repair of the whole body. You may know people who have hyperthyroidism and their body is like revved up, activated all the time. They can be very warm. They can have, they tend to be very thin because their metabolism is so high. There's lots of other effects, right? So the thyroid plays a role in tissue repair and tissue growth, warming of the body. And when the thyroid hormone is below homeostatic levels, the hypothalamus will pick that up and it'll send thyroid releasing hormone, those hormone precursors, thyroid releasing hormone down to the adenohypophysis, telling the gland, hey, manufacture and release more thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes from the pituitary into the bloodstream, binds to the thyroid, and causes the thyroid to manufacture and release more thyroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone causes the release of thyroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone causes the release of thyroid hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone comes from the anterior pituitary. Okay, prolactin. Prolactin is what causes lactation. Pro meaning like ahead of or before, prolactin. So prolactin is before lactation. Prognosis, like prognosis, is before knowing or for knowing. Like gnosis means knowing, so a prognosis is knowing what's going to happen before it happens in someone's disease state. So one of the questions on the MBLEx will be after diagnosis, you make a prediction how long a patient will need, how long a client will need to recover from back pain. What is this called? Is this called diagnosis? Is this called prognosis? The answer is prognosis. Okay, endorphins. I don't know all the endorphins. I think some of them are, I think oxytocin is actually an endorphin, but that's in the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, could just do like the decent thing and look it up for you, right? The anterior pituitary then manufactures and releases alpha endorphins, beta endorphins, and theta endorphins. Okay, there you go. Endorphins make you feel good. They lower pain responses. They create bonding. I think maybe serotonin is a type of endorphin. Okay, and then growth hormone, G, growth hormone. Growth hormone is also called human growth hormone, or HGH. If anyone here is like works with athletes or is an athlete, you may have heard of HGH. It's like all the rage because it can cause the body to produce more natural anabolic steroid, such as estrogen or testosterone. So, and I think HGH might be one of the hormones that's administered synthetically to treat people who have low testosterone levels. Just to give you an idea of like further idea, just to flesh out how the mechanism might work. Okay, so flat peg, because you'll never remember all those. Like I mean, I have to look at it myself, and you know, I've been learning this stuff since yesterday. Flat peg, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone. Letter T, unmute yourselves and call out if you can remember. It's a good chance to practice your recall. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, and then the P, what's the P stand for? Prolactin, that's right. And then the E stands for endorphins, that's right. And then the G,
growth hormone.
Okay. Yeah, good. So what I would say is that if you can remember like flat peg, and remember that flat peg comes from the anterior pituitary, you've almost got it made. You don't have to try to remember every single hormone and what it does. And you certainly don't need to remember, oh, okay, these pre-hormones like thyroid releasing hormone, cortical releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. You don't need to remember like all of those that come from the hypothalamus that cause the release of the flat peg hormones. You don't have to remember that, but understanding it will give you some context. It'll make it less intimidating, and maybe you'll be able to discern some things or pick out some things more easily during the test. And then oxytocin and ADH come from the posterior pituitary. I mean, you just have to remember it's oxytocin and ADH. A little bit more information about oxytocin to like flesh it out for you. Oxytocin is released regularly during birth. The reason oxytocin is released is because it both reduces the pain level and increases pleasurable sensations in the body, and that's to encourage the process of birth and basically to support the woman who's giving birth, or rather to support the person who's giving birth. And then oxytocin being released in response to uterine contractions is one of the few positive feedback cycles. Usually the body releases these things in response to negative feedback. There's not enough follicle development. There's not enough luteinizing hormone, so make more. There's not enough cortisol, so make more ACTH. There's not enough thyroid hormone, so make more thyroid stimulating hormone, etc. Right? But oxytocin is released when there is stimulation to the uterus. Also, when there is stimulation to the areola on the breast during breastfeeding, it's also released at that time. One of the few positive feedback hormones. In fact, I think maybe the only positive feedback hormone. Posterior pituitary. Okay, let's see. Do I need to torture you guys on anything else? Yeah, sure, why not? Because, you know, you would think I don't like you, but I actually do like you. Okay, I just want you to be familiar with this terminology, the HP axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The reason adrenal is in parenthesis is because instead of adrenal, you could put like the gonads, the testes and the ovaries, or you could put pancreas, or you could put the thyroid, or you could put, you know, any other gland in the body, any other hormone producing gland in the body. So the HP is the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So up here you have the hypothalamus at the top of the body, and then below it you have the pituitary. Excuse me. And so the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary stimulates the effector organ, or the gland, right? So it's, in this case, it's the hypothalamus pituitary to adrenal glands. And that would look like, let's see if we can get this out of here. That would look like this. The hypothalamus senses that cortisol is low, so it releases cortisol releasing hormone, I think it's called, It stimulates ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, in the pituitary. ACTH travels through the bloodstream and stimulates the adrenal gland to produce, ooh, it's not epinephrine, that's a mistake in the video, god damn it. It's cortisol. When cortisol levels rise to sufficient levels, the hypothalamus senses that and cuts off CRH, which cuts off ACTH, which stops the production of cortisol. Look at that. And you call yourself a teacher. This is the hypothalamic-pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. I just want you guys to know about that axis, but it could be HPG, hypothalamic-pituitary gonadal. Like if testosterone or estrogen are low, the hypothalamus releases gonadotropic releasing hormone, or the hypothalamus causes the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone or growth hormone or luteinizing hormone, which then binds to the gonads, the testes or the ovaries. Then once testosterone or estrogen or progesterone are in correct levels, reach homeostasis, that sends a signal back to the hypothalamus to stop the process of releasing hormones and stimulating hormones to the gonads. That's called negative feedback. And the axis is something that might be mentioned. I have seen it in review materials. By the way, if you guys want to know what review sites I use, I've used 3 different review sites. The first one I don't remember. The second one is YouGoPrep. YouGoPrep, I would say, like, yeah, the strength of YouGoPrep is that there's a shit ton of questions on there. But I think the AMTA app is the most important. It doesn't have as many questions as YouGoPrep. YouGoPrep has something like 10 different versions of the MBLEx that you can take all the questions. But it's you know, it's a monthly subscription. The AMTA app is free, and the MBLEx is administered in part by the AMTA, American Massage Therapy Association. So so you guys have to get the AMTA app for your phone. And most of the questions that we use will be taken from that app. So just so you have a little bit more understanding, the MBLEx, the Massage and Bodywork Licensing Examination, is administered by the Federation of State Massage Therapy Boards, the Federation of State Massage Therapy Boards. And the Federation of State Massage Therapy Boards goes to the AMTA and has the AMTA, works with the AMTA to develop questions, AMTA and MBLEx. So it's the Federation of Massage Therapy Boards, and it's the AMTA that makes up the MBLEx. If you go to amtamassage.org, there's like a ton of good information on there. Where's the MBLEx? Okay, I'm not going to spend time looking for that, but you know, you can find free the MBLEx study app, and it's really great. It's really great. It's a good one. Got a whole lot of questions on it. Let's look at the outline while we're here. Okay, we have anatomy and physiology. Anatomy and physiology, that's what we're doing right now with the nervous system, the structure of nerves, which hormones are which. We're doing that. That's anatomy and physiology. Kinesiology, that's what we started our sessions with like the movement of joints, the eccentric, concentric, the planes of movement. Pathology we haven't covered yet, but we're gonna cover that. So that's pathology, contraindications, areas of caution, special populations. That's like how do you treat someone? What do you look out for in someone who has a cardiovascular condition and is taking beta blockers compared to warfarin? Warfarin compared to I'm blanking, but anyway, you get the idea. No, this is too late. And then benefits and physiological effects of techniques that manipulate soft tissue. That's like, what technique does this immediately to the body, and how does the body react to that technique? That's called mechanical effect and reflexive effect. We'll go over all that later. Client assessment, reassessment, and treatment planning. And then ethics, boundaries, laws, and regulations, and then guidelines for professional practice. These last two are like pretty similar, but not the same. So we're gonna hammer anatomy and physiology, kinesiology, and then pathology every session. We just spent the first 2 sessions building out anatomy and physiology, building out kinesiology. Next time we'll start to build out pathology. We'll add a little bit more to each one of these 3 sections, and then we'll repeat stuff over and over. We'll review stuff in the beginning, and then we'll start focusing on these other areas. When I've taught this class in the past and people have taken the exam, those who failed the very sections that I did not cover in the exam. So the last person who failed an exam was like the smartest person in the group, in my opinion. And I focused so much on A&P, kinesiology, benefits, and pathology that I did not cover assessment, guidelines, and ethics. And those 3 she failed. And I was like, that's like personal failure, you know? Okay, it's 10 o'clock. You guys can leave if you want to. I'm gonna, yeah, that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
No.
Okay. It was a lot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot. But
I drew the brain though.
great, that's awesome. I'm glad you drew the brain. Draw it like 2-3 times a week.
Well, yesterday I had drew the little myelin.
The neuron.
So when you were talking about it, everything was just clicking. So
Nice. That's great. Everything was clicking. Awesome. I love it. Okay. I will go through this before our next class, and for this section on the hypothalamus-pituitary and neuron, I will put in bold only a few things that I want you to make sure that you study like daily or a couple times a week. Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank
take care,
you.
guys. You're welcome. Have a great week, and I will see you on Tuesday at 8 p.m.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.